I've been using the coffee and then this weird like combination of tea where it's like black tea, green tea, and then the acetylcholine and then paracetam.
Paracetam's good.
Or no, alpha GPC. That's what it was.
Oh, alpha GC. What is that?
We put it in our pre-workout too. It's just like another
I feel like
nootropic.
I've heard of that. It's like in a lot of energy drinks, right?
It is. It's in a lot of them. I think it is like an analog to acetylcholine or like a supporter.
So acetylcholine is one of like the precursor drugs, right? That goes involved with any. I'm trying to think about like what behaviors that is influenced by the acetylcholine whenever you're consuming these things, you know, like that's what I always feel like is the most misunderstood or like not understood aspect of drugs is just like, okay, I'll take these extra exogenous, meaning any drug outside, right? Like we'll take all these exogenous chemicals. What behavior am I trying to amplify or trying to minimize, right? By taking it. Like when I have acetylcholine and I'm presented with like, okay, your boss says like, okay, I want you to develop this Excel sheet, right? What does Excel sheet A look like without the acetylcholine versus B? Like, does it change organizational habits, for example? Or does it change like, you know, different subtleties in your communication tactics? Like, you know, that's what I'm always curious about. Like, how does the actual behavioral change of either communication or actual productive habits change when you introduce these types of, you know, and they're very minor, obviously. Mm-hmm. Like what the metric you'd actually have to have is going to be so subtle and like you're not actually going to find, you know, something, I don't know, without a very detailed metric, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's kind of like I feel like it's kind of a brave new world. Like what do these drugs do in your exact metric quantifiable properties of outcome,
right?
Like
right.
I give you X amount of this drug, like what is the measurable change in what you're able to produce? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, I have this person, let's call him like, you know, typical villain, right? What is the neurochemical cocktail of a villain look like relative to a hero in a society, like based on our standards, you know what I mean? Like, all right, they have this like just mixture of like chemicals and like, you know, you could isolate the top like three, like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, right? Which like the most like talked about. There's also like GABA, you know, there's also all of these other different types of neurotransmitters that definitely play roles. But I'm just saying like what if you just found like the balance of like the top three and like, you know, like the other 10% of like the neurochemical cocktail, let's just neglect because it's probably like a bunch of random shit, you know, like there's in that 10%, there's probably like hundreds, thousands of different types of weird little chemicals. But like, does a villain just have like, if you look at the top three, does a villain just have like a hyper extended like dopamine system? Cause like they're villains. So they basically are constantly, you know, rewarded for taking other people's stuff or, you know, hurting people because they get that reward. Like, you know what I mean? You see where I'm going with it?
I think they've talked about that in the context of like presidents, how those people, even to want to be president, like you have to have such a uniquely like bizarre neurochemical combination where you're kind of a sociopath, like kind of a psychopath for even wanting that type of position. Like when you see supervillains or people that actually commit like violent crimes or like mass organized crime of villainy, like what is the neurochemical structure going on in that brain to incentivize and reward those desires for malicious
well, if you look at the like
actions,
like I don't know if you remember, but the shooter on University of Texas campus, I don't remember when this happened, when he killed like
the 70s,
right? Or something like that. Yeah. But more or less, I mean, the dude wrote a note after he killed all these people. He's like, hey, check out my brain, man. Like there's something screwed up in there. Turns out, yeah, they looked into this brain and he had a massive tumor pressing onto his amygdala. And amygdala is a really big control center for emotions and so forth. And so it's like, okay, like what happens when you take like fear out of the equation? What is fear? Like if we put it into a biochemical context, is fear just like, you know, is it, hey, maybe this guy's acetylcholine just wasn't being bind to a receptor, which has this other mechanism and creates this behavior where it's like, hey, go kill people. You know, it's like, or is it like, you know, I guess I'm looking for the motivations, right? Like that's where it always comes down to, because like where you identify a motivation, you'll find an outcome, more or less. Like give it enough time. Right?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting like point to think about, because I think a lot of the actions in reflections we try and make of why people are the way they are as adults and the actions they take and who they become, it's so apparent to try and deduce that from like the childhood that they had, the experiences that they had, like the environment they grew up in. But then when you have such things as like a tumor that can grow and press on the amygdala and make a significantly drastic personality changing event happen, what is the physical and immediate ramifications, but also changes that you can make? Say like, what if I just press? Like, what if I just press on this part of the brain? Physically, what happens if I just touch those neurons and constrict those neurons? Or like, even more so, electrically control neurons and stimulate different aspects of this environment for like neurochemical equilibriums that we can say for depression, anxiety, addiction, all these things that are extreme highs in dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, or extreme lows, and an inability to regulate those oscillations as they go to high highs and low lows. What if there was some self-learning device implanted in your brain that was like a slow release or timed release serotonin or dopamine or other neurochemicals, where you precisely define ranges for those concentrations, and then when a patient or someone is going through like a low, you just kind of bring them back up a little bit, or a high.
Yeah, like and almost a whole new external homeostasis system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like a pre-built.
Only on the error, only on like the extreme error bars, because then what it's like, my child was just born and I have euphoric excitement. Like, you don't want to dull that down.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say. Like, when you present like a different homeostasis, then are you also going to reward to say I literally kill someone, right? And I get all the different reactional states that are potentially very bad on my psyche. But now I have this homeostatic system, which is going to basically put me back to a baseline. It's like, oh, killing people isn't that bad now. Because we have this external homeostatic control that's, just regulating the emotion. But you might also say, okay, well, a person would never kill someone because we'd never build the homeostatic control that actually elicits that motivation. Yeah. So then there's your like counter argument to that. So it's like, it's a very interesting like thing. And, I think that's what's so tough is like when you're defining an individual, you shouldn't define them by, what outcomes they've made, really, because it doesn't show you the future time scale of that person either. It doesn't show you the potential. You ask the question, what are your motivations? Boom, whole different world view of that person, and it's a tough question, right? And the tougher it is, that also tells you something about a person as well. You know what I mean?
That reminds me of the Hulu or like Netflix documentary of Alex Honnold, the guy who free solo climbed El Capitan. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Like watching him try it over and over and over until he was like, yep, I'm going to do it without a rope. I'm going to climb all the way up. It was just terrifying. And then they looked at his brain and they said, oh, you have very, very low activity in your amygdala. And he was just like, okay, like, all right, what does that mean? I'm going to go climb now. I don't feel fear when I do this. And that was just shocking, where I think about how much of your personality, of who you are, your ego, your mind, your soft personality is actually a reflection of just physical neurochemical manifestations, and how easily one can change. Like as easily as when you have traumatic brain injury and you lose your ability to interpret English or your language or write, that it turns off like a switch. And to think of all of who you are, all of your goals and aspirations and personality and where you derive happiness could be a switch. It's kind of uncomfortable to think about.
Yeah. I mean, here's what I'm thinking about. That gets me thinking like, okay, for that guy, it's rock climbing that really starts suppressing that amygdala. So like for each individual, what I'm imagining is like you create like, say like 100 activities, right? And every individual will be very different depending on what effects that activity has. But what you do is you'd have this, basic dichotomy of 100 activities, and you'd have individuals just do each one of them, right? And see where it goes. You do a little brain scan before and after, and you see how these activities change that person. And so then over time, it's not like, hey, what drug do I need to take? It's, hey, an activity will cause my body to react in a specific way, which produces specific drugs that allow me to change in the future. What are those activities for me? And at another level, you could say, okay, well, what's pleasurable for me, right? And this kind of gets into like at least from my eyes, the cognitive behavioral therapy session. But, it is very interesting when you try to say, okay, well, what are the activities, outside of just trying to like make me happier or whatever that means? Like, what are the activities that are going to make me better at learning? Just generic learning, right? Is it, do I learn how many languages maybe? People always say like languages are a really good way to like, start to engage a new part of your brain, but I mean like, what are those activities? Like, what's that optimization, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, what would those lists look like? I guess I'll just start with you. Like, what are your activities? Just
The lists that I think make
Yeah,
me
like-
smarter.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it comes down to all of my different physical senses and like the way I think my brain kind of goes through like states of challenge. And one thing that really inspired me to try and address this directly was reading about, or at least hearing about, this podcast that was talking about the waking states of the brain. So you have your circadian rhythm, and then there's other like cycles of the brain goes through. I think it was called like the Arcadian rhythm or something like that. I might be butchering the name, but you have a sleep cycle that your body's used to regardless of like what time zone you're in, right? So like, that's why, oh yeah, I'm used to sleeping at 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time or whatever. But your brain also goes through 24-hour cycles every like 90 minutes. And that's why when you specifically pay attention to the times of the day where you're the sharpest or kind of in a slump, it's like, okay, is this actually like my energy levels changing throughout the day? Is it my diet and like my blood sugars changing because you have like a carb heavy lunch? Or are there actual rhythmic patterns that your brain goes through during the day, and how you can identify those and target them and say, okay, if I know my brain can go in 90-minute intervals for different styles of learning and interpreting things and focused work and hard learning, identify when those are and try and utilize them. And I notice 100% for myself that I hit a crash regardless of what I eat for lunch, regardless of if I exercise or not. Like, exercise always helps, but at 1:45 every single day, I get tired. I get this like brain fog. And I know that right when I wake up from like 7 a.m. until like noon, almost like right before lunch, I am so sharp. I'm so sharp, and I can sit down and just crank through like deep work problems, which I think is really cool. So
What's interesting though, because what you've just identified is a gap in your cognitive span. So what's an activity you can do in your gap time that actually decreases that gap time? Right. And this is where it gets interesting. So it's like, if you have an activity for, any type of behavioral change that I want to make, whatever I want to do, maybe I just want to like, be more like mathematical, right? Or analytical or something for some like reason. I don't know. And like, what's an activity do I do to just make me more analytical? Is it, going online, doing a quick math problem?
Yeah.
When I'm in that kind of slump. And even though I'm in a slump, I get it done. And what I'll notice is a massive just decrease or minimize in my gap period. Right. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it's just, it's different for every individual. So there's no like formulaic way of doing it. But I just think it's very interesting. Whenever you have those gaps, it means, hey, there is a reaction in my body going on that I don't particularly like, and it's not particularly helpful for me. So it's like, okay, well, let's try some things in this gap time. Because clearly what I'm doing right now in my gap time isn't working. Right. Because I did too. I get these like slump periods as well. And I'm like, okay, when I'm in my slump period, it's like, I got to move. I got to go do something different. It can't be work. It can be work, I guess, but it needs to be a different way of engaging with the material. Like if I'm on my computer, like in an Excel or like looking at like some kind of like graphs or doing some like, maths or formulas or whatever, it can't be anything like that. It has to be something very different. It has to be like doing piano or something like that, yes. Right? Yep. Jumping off, doing a quick beat of piano. It has to be something kind of engaging as well, though. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like just something to just speak in a different language all of a sudden. This is why I brought up that point about language before. Is like, what is it? How do I just suddenly change the way my brain's communicating like that?
Do you think you should do things that are completely different than what your normal tasks are all day? So like you do math, you do computation, you do, biology all day long, and you have to think about those problems. And in those slumps, do you think you should try and do more specific math or something completely different, like practice a language or play piano or chess or like draw something? I think it's a good question, because I mean, how much variation, right, is the generic part. How much variation do I have in my daily regimen? Like, if my like piano is one of the ones that like helps eliminate brain fog in that gap zone or whatever you want to call it, that slump zone, right? How long will piano be able to get me out of that gap zone? If I do it 5 days in a row, is my body going to get used to it? And then I'm going to start associating slump time with my piano again? If so, then go back to doing work again. See if now what used to make you feel slumpy, now doesn't make you feel slumpy anymore, right? Yeah. It's like one of those things. And like it's if you take someone who already is hyper productive or hyper focused on a lot of different things, is their baseline raised so that
right?
Like if slump equals baseline of person, is that raised to their own subjective lifestyle. So like you take someone who's hyper productive and you say, you know what, instead of working 18 hours a day, you have to work 16 hours a day, and they feel horribly lazy or like unproductive that day. Or if you're used to doing like 6 hours of work and then 2 hours of piano and then 4 hours of reading for 6 months, will that just feel normal?
Right. And you get the normal slumps. So it's like, I always say this, but it's like everything in moderation, even moderation, right? Sometimes you just gotta do something different. It doesn't matter what, just do something different. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, like I'm noticing something different as well, like in my behavior as well. And yeah, I mean, it's just like, well, what are those activities? Like you want to find them, and the quicker you find them, the quicker you can move from task A to task B, assuming you want to do a bunch of cool stuff.
Well, I think I've heard this like time and time again from like fitness trainers and different programs is you need to follow a diligent, specific routine for 8 weeks. But after 8 weeks, you need to change it. So like the patterns of exercises that you go through, the type like the type of exercises you're performing, you should do them regularly and going through progressive overload, like trying to reach like a percentage of a 1 rep max or like a certain volume per workout, whatever your goal is. But then you need to change it because your body will start getting used to that pattern of exercises, the frequency of those exercises, and like shocking the body, whether it's, I don't know, thermal or cognitive or physical, chemical like surprise keeps your body and your brain adapting, constantly paying attention.
Right. And so that's why it's like, don't be a drug addict to a single chemical. Be a drug addict to, maybe I shouldn't use that word, right? But try out, scratch that. I mean, I was going to say like try out multiple drugs so that you're putting your body in a constant state of adaptation, but that can get you into some loose zones. So
drugs in the context of general chemicals, like
right,
neurochemicals, and
exactly. Like, I mean, I'm saying food as another type of like drug, like, like do I carb load before my next workout zone? I mean, like that's what I mean. That's why I say drug. It can be confusing, but I have a very like vague understanding of like what drug is. Cause like if you look it up online, it's just like anything that really, when you present it into the body, causes a psychoactive reaction.
Very true. The way we define that is so loose, and you kind of sit on this ridge looking down on one side and you see like the general definition and context of drugs. And then you're on top of the ridge and you're like, okay, I work in pharmaceutical or biotechnological drugs. But then you look down the other side of the ridge and in the next valley and you see sex, gambling, alcohol, caffeine, lifestyles, making money, like fame, like all of it does release drugs into your brain that build the same type of neurochemical and circuit addiction patterns that smoking has.
Right. And
crazy.
I think the general conception of drug is really segregated by the time scale. So people, when they think of a drug, they think of a low, short time scale. So it's like a day, right? And so anything that has a potent psychoactive effect within a day is usually what people call a drug, right? When they have alcohol, they notice the effects immediately. Whenever you eat food, however, you don't notice effects necessarily immediately as far as the intense experience. But if you continue eating that over day, the amalgam of eating, like sweet potatoes will have a certain intense effect on your body, but it won't be during those time periods. It'll be based on the last couple of days of eating habits as well. And so it's like the time scale is a huge part of the equation as well. And so, I mean, that's just something that's super hard to kind of grapple with. And my diet is such an issue. It's like, okay, well, where do I draw the line? Like, if I have this diet for a week, if I instead just cut off it at 8 days, then is that 8 day period a drug? Like that's the 8 day period that causes, what I would assume is a normal intense reaction from a drug. Right. And so it's like, I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to bind the two terms food and drug together, but maybe that just causes too much confusion in the grand scheme of if you want to change your behavior and if you know how to and what to change that behavior, Well,
I mean, in direct respect to like food, the stomach is like the second brain. Like looking at new research and stuff that comes out about how many like nerves you have in your stomach and like in your gut and like what that does to your overall well-being, like literally eating good foods will make you feel so much better. And I think looking at how just little minimal differences and like the type of caffeine you intake, like, do I get it from soda? Do I get it from coffee? Do I get it from an energy drink? Like, just like different alcohols give you a different drunk feeling. People know like, oh, tequila, like that's going to be a wild night versus like a couple beers or, you know,
Right.
a whiskey soda, whatever. They have different feelings, but it's still alcohol, right? But they make you feel a different level of drunk. So like where you get your caffeine, where you get your nutrition, it makes such a drastic difference. And we only see it in the either on the time scale of a long time or in the extremes. So like greater minimums and maximums on a shorter time scale, observable. Otherwise you have to wait.
Right. I guess this is where it gets interesting in my eyes is like, okay, what if I start eating healthy, you know, every other day I eat healthy, then not healthy. So I eat healthy Monday, don't eat healthy on Tuesday, I eat healthy on Wednesday. But then it's like, okay, then I'll have some behavior here. Do I sum the last 3 days, right? And so it's net healthy because I had Monday healthy, Tuesday unhealthy, Wednesday healthy. But now on Thursday, it's like, do I sum those last 3 days or am I looking even further back, right? Am I looking for the last couple of days? At what point in the food history of a person does that become relevant to how you feel now, right? That's I guess what I'm wondering. Like if I ate unhealthy for the first like 20 years of my life, but the last year of my life, right now I'm like, say I'm 21 now, right? And so for 20 years I ate unhealthy. And the last year I ate super fucking healthy, right? Only the healthiest stuff, right? Do I feel, you know, good even now, like, right? Like because I've been eating healthy for just the last year, or is it the fact that I've been eating unhealthy for 20 years, right? And like the time scales just add up. So it's like 20 years healthy minus 1 unhealthy is like 19 overall unhealthy.
No, I don't think so. I think it's absolutely, you'll have both. So you eat unhealthy for 20 years and you'll still feel the repercussions of that going forward in different areas. But I think you can absolutely fix and make up for a lot of those habits and the implications that it had on your health with consistent healthy behaviors. And I think that's in the context of like mental health as well. Like people go through periods of addiction and depression and anxiety.
It's all about consistency then.
Exactly.
It's not about the previous last couple of whatever time scale we want to call it. It's just about being consistent up to that point.
From a psychology perspective, from a lifestyle perspective. So it's like tomorrow's day one. And like tomorrow can always be day one for all the different types of people who are trying to make challenges and changes and take the first step and looking at how long the process will be, saying, oh, you know, like I've done it for so many years, it will be such a long path forward, but tomorrow will always be like day one. And I think in the context of trying to look at like an aggregate of all of it, I think it's on a shorter scale than that for sure.
And then here's where we throw in the idea of what we were talking about before, which is variation. So now we're presented with a conflict. It's like, okay, you have some limited amount of variation that gives you that, you know, higher well-being, but we also need to be consistent. So you need to be consistently varied, right?
Make a habit of breaking your habits.
Right. But also keeping habits, right? And it's this constant balance of how consistent before it gives me into the slump. And my productivity, right? Because there's 2 coins here.
So if your goal is to constantly live in a state of adaptation, what's your driving force? Desire?
Curiosity. Or, I mean, it could be knowledge. And I mean, I guess curiosity and knowledge are equivalent in this sense.
Because I think the greatest periods where you learn the most is when you have to adapt to something new and figure out how your new personality or your new living situation or your new mentality has to fit into this new puzzle piece that you've just put in front of your path. You now have to change your shape to fit through this next puzzle. So I guess what is the driving force behind that? I think mine's desire. I think mine is the obsessive desire to know what it feels like to be unbelievably passionate about something. Like to know what that feeling feels like, to be so obsessively passionate about something. I crave that desire.
Right.
The desire to know, I crave that feeling.
The desire to have a desire.
Yeah.
And to be able to control when you have that desire.
Obsessive passion over something. Over your trade or your knowledge, your intellectual growth. I think
Right. And
That's what drives me.
And I said that was like somewhat of a curiosity because I mean, I'm assuming that desire isn't devoted to one thing, right? In your case,
No.
Right. It's multiple things, but you want to hone the same level of passion in each one of those things so that as an amalgam, it's like all these like unique things that you do, but the same passion is thrown into each one of these categories. So it's not like you have a desire to do one thing. It is you have a desire to be in a point where you are experiencing desire at different levels.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, okay, well, if your motivation or your desire is so kind of, I guess, vague, what keeps it intact when you don't necessarily know what your desire needs to manifest into at a given point in your career, in your life, or your relationship? You know what I mean? Like, so like if I'm not necessarily passionate about my job, well, that must mean, you know, like I'm not exercising the passion in the right domains to get my job done. You see what I mean? And so it's like, it brings up that question. It's like, well, what could I do to get the same thing done, but to have more passion while doing it? Right.
Can you brute force it, do you think? Because I feel like
you have to, like initially, right?
I feel like so often I hear about people, especially coming out of like their undergraduate or their graduate first couple of years out of school, more often than not, I feel like are not particularly happy with what they're doing. And I think that's something that I hear fairly regularly is how people are trying to find the satisfaction in their roles and their careers and their jobs. And you go through this kind of 6-month rapid fire cycle of life, essentially for 20 years.
Right.
Like for 20 straight years, you're going from summer break, fall, spring, summer break, fall, spring, summer break. And it's just school. Then you're dropped into the real world. Right. And then people have these ideas and visions of what life will be like when you get there. But now, do you have to brute force this passion, or is that not the right way to do it? And you need to find an area that organically, like, what are you thinking about when you don't have to?
Well, right. And I think here, this is where I'm just going to jump on one of the words you use, which is, or phrases, is real world. When you enter the real world, and that changes how your desires are. Because I mean, I don't really know what the real world is. And I think if you think you're going to the real world, like before you were in the fake world, right? But now you're in the real world. It's like something happened there. Like, why? So if I'm in the fake world, maybe the same desires don't work in the real world now. And so that's maybe what causes the confusion. Oh. It's, you know, you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's like, you know, you're never really changing worlds. Like you're maturing. You're maturing your desires. And so I think if you think that there's an actual like hard line transition between, you know, fake world and real world, like I'm entering the real world is what people say, like, oh, wait till you get into the real world. It's like, well, if I wait till I get into the real world, then what has the last 20 years of my life been doing as I've been developing and so forth? I've been developing for a world that I've never existed in. Right. And so then when I enter the real world, I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing because I've never been in this world. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. See what I'm saying? It's like, what is the real world?
It's like it's a 21-year tutorial for the wrong game.
Right. Exactly. And so it's like, okay, I can brute force stuff, but in my other world, it wasn't necessarily a need to brute force things because I was living in the world that I wanted. Right. That's at least the fake world. It's like the world where your responsibilities maybe aren't as important to get done, or the responsibilities that other people think you should get done, more or less, right? And so the brute force is that really you need to get things done that other people say you need to get done, which is true. I mean, like you need to like get your basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs done and so forth. But you know, at that top, it's like the real world doesn't have that top, right? That top of like self-actualization and self-realization for your desires. And the real world, I think when people refer to it, it's just like you cut that part of the Maslow's hierarchy out. You know, that top part of like self-actualization, you just do like basic necessities. You grow up, and once you're in the real world, you just take care of your basic necessities, and then you die. And like, that's okay. Yeah. You know, no wonder you had to brute force everything, you know?
Do you think we actually live in the, like, not in like a metaphorical context, but like, do you even think this is like the real world, like the United States where we live right now, California? Like, I don't, this is not the real world. Like this is still it's still it's still a game.
On a statistical population level, obviously not, because the 330 million, right, is such a small population of the world. Like if we took like the average world, like if you took the amalgam of all humans that currently exist and develop some kind of perception, some kind of like AI perception of what the world is now based on that average statistical demography of humans across the world, you know, you can create a world that no one lives in. But it'll be the most common one to everyone because it is the average world, but no one lives in the average worlds. Right. And so, I mean, it depends where you want to, what kind of world you want to be in the end of the day. And that's why I say it's like, well, wait till you get in the real world. It's like, no. Wait till you get into the world that you want to be in. And that's what it should always be. It's just, do you want to be in this world or not? Right. That's the general question. And it's like, if you want to be in this world, fucking fulfill your passions and desires, because you only got a limited amount of time to do it. Right. And there's all this like, you know, crazy variation, habit structures, you know, optimization and so forth. But at the very, very beginning preliminary line, before we even start on the race, it's like, you know, what world do you want to be in? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's always key. And for me, it's like, I want to be in a world of curiosity. Right. And so that's my driving force. Right. And that's why I never feel like I have to like brute force things necessarily. Like sometimes there is like some like, you know, random like software I'll find online or some kind of like thing. And I'm like, oh, this would be great if I just knew this coding language, then it would help me like work out all these like logic structures in my head. And I will have to brute force learning that software. But once I learn it, it's like, oh, now I can be creative in this means and develop that passion. So there's like kind of this balance of brute force. I don't know.
I think I would agree with that. I think it makes me wonder when I think about like the state of people now, and like what I most frequently hear people talking about is, do you think the advent and the accessibility for so much different immersive technological imagination to exist in our lives and our minds makes people more dissociative from our real world and withdrawn and depressed? Because not just on the like the surface level of like video games and like social media and the ability to open like an app and look through 50 different lenses across the world and see what people are idealizing in that area. But I mean, like, really imagine the different realities that could possibly exist, and then coming back out and seeing where we are. It's like taking a color filter on everything and then taking it off. And I wonder if this makes people less excited to try and change this world and instead go back into the much more safe, real digital world where you can create anything and everything without material restrictions whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you only go into the real world. And I heard this on, that's just a fantastic show, but you suit up like a coal mine.
What show?
It was the Bo Burnham's Inside. Unbelievable. But I think the thing that stuck with me the most is like the real world is like a coal mine. You suit up, you go in, you get what you have to do to bring things back to the much more real, much more important digital world where things exist and your identity matters there even more. Right.
And I think it's interesting because you're seeing the internet as a canvas for human reaction. I think more or less is you're looking at the outcomes of how things have affected people, right? And you're seeing that canvas of emotions and desires painted onto it in this virtual non-material world. Like before, I could, look at what you owned like materially and kind of, understand a little bit about that person. But now it's like, now I have to understand the reactionary elements. And I mean, like, you can look at like art online and so forth, and that'll kind of show. But again, all this stuff is just abstract things created in your head. Yeah. And as much as, our computers materialize it on our screens, in the end of the day, it lives in just some kind of, non-concrete data packets, right? That we are all so gung-ho about. But our emotions more or less are just data packets now. Yeah. Right. Than actual, sensations that we can touch and feel with. I don't know. Maybe that's too far. Maybe you can really touch. You can get touched by things online. Like, don't get me wrong. But like, I don't know. I'm just trying to draw the contrast between like feeling online versus feeling in reality. That is the material, in person world. Right.
I'm going to go on a projection, or at least an idea train, and hopefully this doesn't get like too sci-fi-y, but it makes me wonder as I imagine forward and try and think like, what could this reality present to itself or present to us in the future, where we get to a place where our emotions get so dulled. Our capability for emotions and reacting to things and feeling feelings becomes so dulled 50, 100 years down the line that what you just said, our emotions become data packets, actually becomes a physical commodity where you have to go to a store or you have to go to a location like a bar. And instead of ordering a drink, you order like, can I have a serotonin boost? Can I have a happy boost? Can I buy some happiness today? Or like my life's been too high lately. Can I buy some neutralizing, some
we do that now.
Agents? Like, can I go buy some empathy from someone real quick?
Right. We do that now. We're just really shitty at it. Like there's just all these weird adverse effects, right? You have all these just kind of symptoms. Like when people want to, suppress their fear, what they're going to do is right now is you're going to drink alcohol. Right. And it's going to make them a little dumber in my eyes. And it's going to make them a little bit less fearful about exposing themselves. Right. Yeah. But right. You have those adverse effects too. Because when you drink alcohol, I mean, if you drink a lot of it, it's a 2-day drug. And the next day you feel like absolute shit. And so like there's this payoff, right. That is just constant, that balance of, okay, if I feel in an intense way, does that intense feeling then take away from the neutral feeling that I'm going to feel tomorrow? And then I'm going to be, I felt, net positive at an extreme level. Then tomorrow, am I going to feel net negative? And I think that's where we have to be careful because we shouldn't be playing with emotions where that optimization exists. I feel is as if because think about it like this, like what if the drug itself, instead of giving us a net positive, what if we take a drug and it has a net negative? And then the next day when we're not on the drug, we have a net positive. What if it's the exact opposite, right? And so then we don't associate the good feelings with the drug. You never build the addiction, right? And then you associate, just doing the drug as kind of a working out experience. Like you go work out, and then it's kind of painful while you're on it, but you get the positive benefits the next day, right? One of those types of things, right? And I think that if you just flip the whole thing around and you try to optimize the exact opposite, you get into something very different type of understanding of it. I
think that's like much more deeper in like well-written psychology is easy pleasure, easy euphoria breeds weakness, or at least the ability to succumb to the desires that are so easy to come by. Whereas difficult challenge equals true euphoria and pleasure.
Stoicism preaches this idea for sure. It's like, imagine the worst possible reality, catastrophize the hell out of it so that you're prepared for anything, right? I mean, there's a level where I think that goes too far, where like, if you have someone who already has a level of anxiety and they start imagining the worst possible scenario, it's like, okay, that's not going to be helpful and conducive to like you getting your shit done, right? Like, it's just take a step back and it's like, imagine something, it's kind of bad that you can actually be prepared for.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you got to level yourself.
I think, yeah, you can go as deep as you want in both directions on that one for true deep, like stoicism and saying like, okay, if I had absolutely nothing, like if you say, okay, look at like people who live in the Congo, the heart of darkness, and then look at all this infrastructure we have and like all of the problems we have become so minuscule. Or if you say, I will get rid of all my belongings entirely, I have no physical belongings whatsoever, and then I am gifted a banana, and that made my week because like that was more than anything I ever had, right? So it's like, where do you want your baseline to go? And I think that's not a problem, but a thought that I have with true stoicism at times, where it's like how firm is your baseline for attachment to things versus ideas versus like where you put the central kind of navigating point for like where I mark pleasure and change. Like right. Like I don't buy something and be like, wow, this made me feel so good. Like clothing, it doesn't matter to me. Or like a car, like that's a functioning vehicle. It doesn't mean anything to me. It has a purpose. It takes me somewhere when I need to take shit with me.
Right. More of a utilitarian approach there as far as the items you use. And, I'm just thinking about now this idea that, an item itself can elicit intense emotions. Like when I give you like that banana, when you took that banana, maybe it wasn't necessarily the banana. I mean, you can buy bananas for like 99 cents a bushel, right? Like 20 cents a banana, right? It's not about the banana itself being that value. It's not like the value of the item correlates to the reaction of the emotion either, right? What I'm getting at is that what I think about the banana, it's like, okay, well, how many other times have you gotten that banana? It comes back to the idea of consistency, right? If you got a banana every day of the week, you wouldn't really care. Day 5, you'd be like, I just got a banana. Like I got a banana yesterday too. But right, and then it comes down to the idea of, okay, how novel is this thing, right? Yeah. And like the novelty of the item itself is what I think causes an emotional reaction correlate of like the intensity of it. It's like, and I think it's twofold. It's like, how novel is it and how valuable is it as well? So if it was a banana, it's like, okay, it's a novel banana, right? Then that's great. It's going to make me feel good, right? And it's going to give me like a net positive feeling, right? But then if I gave you that banana again tomorrow, you wouldn't really care. But then let's say I gave you like I don't know, like a nice coffee mug, like $100 hand woven coffee mug, right? On day 1, you're like, hell yeah, I got a dope ass coffee mug. Never had this before. And then day 2, I give you another coffee mug. You're going to be like, hell yeah, I got another dank ass coffee mug, right? Because what's happening there, I think, is that value will inflate that reaction over time. So even though it becomes less novel, just because it's such a high value, it'll allow that item, that same rewarding item, to persist for a longer period. So like day 2, you start on the banana. Day 2, you start losing like, that was great, I got a banana. Versus day 2 on the coffee mug, you're like, hey, I still got a cool coffee mug, because the coffee mug itself is more valuable, right? Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? So it's like two variables, I think, novelty and the value of the item, the societal value of the item, mm-hmm. right? That basically coin your reaction, the intense reaction to it.
Yeah. Or I guess the inverse of that. So say like in mouse and rat experiments, when they give them like cocaine or water or whatever at a regular time every day, like the Pavlovian experiment, where it's like you ring the bell, right? Every single time they come, but like, okay, so they're so used to it every day. I give you 11 a.m. every day, your food, your banana, and you're so used to it that it has no novelty anymore. And it's so consistent that you expect it every day. So the range of excitement or like neurochemical additive that brings is diminished over time. I don't know if that's diminishing returns, but then is the gain in neurochemical excitement from receiving that on an expected consistent basis equal to the loss of not receiving it one day,
right,
out of surprise? I guess it makes me think like when you have these consistent additives to your life that you're so used to that are part of a regular pleasure center or routine. I don't mean like pleasure center in the sense of what brings you like excessive pleasure, but I'm just saying like your cup of coffee, your favorite breakfast, your little nuances and idiosyncrasies that you have for your life that make it better on a regular basis. Is there a diminished return over time in that time aspect that we were looking at of the level of happiness or pleasure that it brings you? And is that a function of it can, if you consistently maintain gratitude and like respect for like where that thing came into your life and how appreciative you are of it? Or is it more of a function of your brain naturally gets used to everything, just like your body will naturally get used to everything? And your brain is not your friend. Your brain is not on the side of your overall body and mind. It will find and take the paths of least resistance for immediate gratification to prolong its existence as a whole.
Right.
It is not trying to make you last forever.
Well, let me stop you there, because I think there's a good point there. Like, your friend is not necessarily your brain. And I think the reason why that is because of the society and the stimuli that this society presents itself with. So following your brain, like you just take opioids all day, right? Because opioids make you feel good. And we didn't used to have opioids there. So the brain doesn't necessarily know the potential negative outcomes of doing that kind of stuff. So it's like, maybe in like primitive societies, follow your brain, right? Because it's like, you don't have those potentially negative stimuli always presenting yourself as you do with society today in modern day. And so it's like, you never really had to worry about like, hey, is this food that makes me feel good right now, right? Is that going to cause a big long-term deficit? I mean, you'd probably think about it a little bit, but we know nowadays, and so it's like exceptionally true that you have to be able to control, those types of stimuli in society that weren't always present before. Mm-hmm. And so like your brain nowadays is kind of not your friend, because people know how to make money on your brain because they know it's base instincts. People know when you go to social media, for example, that your brain's going to behave in specific ways, and they know how to, put your attention into specific places on the web. And so that's where your brain becomes not your friend, because they're using your basic impulses of rewards and so forth to control the experience that you have while using maybe a software or whatever it is. And so that's where your brain becomes, not your friend. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so it gets really tricky there, because when is your brain your friend? Like, when do I just trust myself, my gut instinct? Like, can I just trust my gut instinct? Like, how often, right? Mm-hmm. Because these days you never really know. I mean, there's people that are very smart, very competent, and know exactly how your brain's going to behave when presented with some kind of thing. That's what all the research and all the different innovation goes with. And so it's very interesting. And I wanted to also bring up another point that you were referencing before, which is, the idea of what is the value of rewards, both negative and positive, as in, like, when the software company is trying to control your experience on there, do they present positive rewards, and the intensity of that positive reward will be the same as if they presented negative rewards, and the intensity of that negative reward? Are those two values equivalent? And I think it's very important when you're understanding how to control human behavior at this level, because it's like, okay, we get them to a point where it's too positive, and they might realize, hey, I got to get off the app and go do something more worthwhile with my life. So then you get to present, negative rewards every once in a while to keep them coming back, keep them coming back on the platform. You don't want them to get, too high-minded, or else they're going to escape and come to the realization, hey, what the hell am I doing right now? But you also, you don't want them to be too negative, or else they're going to have the exact same effect. Mm-hmm. And so it comes to the idea as like, can I increase this positive? Let's put it on a numerical scale. So it's just really simple. So say you have some baseline emotion, let's just call it 0, right? I present reward A, right? And it gives you 2 points up on the scale. And I present you a reward A, but it's a negative version. Does it move you negative 2 points, right? Does the same stimuli, when presented to two different people, one has a positive outlook about that stimuli, one has a negative outlook of that stimuli, right? Do they basically have the same magnitude of influence on that individual as well? And I think it just, I'm really just trying to think about how these people understand controlling, how much rewards do I give this person to motivate some specific action, whatever it may be. Maybe it's staying on my platform. Maybe it's sending out a couple more tweets, right? Or whatever the hell it is, But I think the power is in knowing what those reward mechanisms are for yourself, so you can identify, hey, this is something I know I have a vulnerability to. This is something I know that I like to do, and I'm seeing it here, and someone else knew that I like to do it as well. I should be exceptionally careful because I know that they've taken advantage of some reward. And sometimes, okay, sometimes it's like, yo, let's just go. Let's just, yeah, you got me right. Like, you might be doing something right. You might have been able to assess who I am, and that's great. But there's a point, I think, where it gets too far, right? And then where you get so locked in the rewards that you forget that you can create your own.
That's interesting. Do you know if, like, the big tech companies hire psychologists or neuroscientists to work for them? Because we've essentially created a commodity and commercialized the neural circuits and transmitters of children and young adults in today's society. It is a commodity now. Who can create the best model for neurochemical retention of usability and screen time of a platform? Do you think they hire, like, psychologists to go through? Because they use so much, such deep levels of machine learning, data analytics, and different metrics to understand the algorithms for usability, for retaining talent and attention on a platform. Like, do you think they purely follow, like, trial and error machine learning to understand what different factors and adjustments and features can keep someone on an app? Or do you think they actually work with psychologists and understand human behavioral psychology to say, what colors and what flow and what things, like, bring you into this platform and want you to stay here?
I actually don't think they do, because of the scale they exist at. So if it was a small scale, I think the need of a psychologist would definitely be valid, right? Because they're not seeing the possible space of reaction. But if they have such a huge scale, like if they're using millions and millions of users and they make some subtle change, they can just look at the data and it'll tell them how the psychology is better than any psychologist ever would, because they have a million data set, instantaneous, real time interaction and so forth. And so when Facebook can, in this case, they can change their UI and they can just see exactly what colors do what, just based on all the stats they already have and all the data bins they are already created. And so they're at a point where the scale is so big that they can find subtle, nuanced, idiosyncratic psychology elements without even, talking to people who've studied this for their whole lives.
Do you think they would make? So if they did,
I think they run into a lot of problems because they don't hire psychologists. I think they run into a lot of problems of abusing human psychology because they're looking at stats and how to, just subtly increase their profit margins and so forth. That's their psychologist. I don't
think it's subtly increasing.
Yeah, maybe it's not a subtle increase, right? It's big increases, right? Yeah. But I mean, I think that is their psychologist. It's Mr. Dollar Sign, is their psychologist. And I think that's, why there's the Netflix documentary about, the social media scandal or whatever you want to call it, or, the social media brainwashing. I forget what the name of the documentary. It's that guy, Tristan Harris. Tristan Harris did the documentary, and it's huge on Netflix. You've probably seen it. I don't know.
Probably have. I think so. I mean, it brings to mind when we live in this micro time frame where I feel like everyone lives for just the plus one. Most often people that I talk to and kind of work with and collaborate with usually live in this kind of plus one mentality where it's okay, what do we do in an hour? What do we do tomorrow? What do we do next week? But it doesn't usually go how do we plan for next year? What does this mean for my 10-year period? What does it mean for my 50-year period? Are you thinking about what your grandkids are going to be living in right now? Some people do, some people don't. But when I think about talking about the 90s, that's where we were born and grew up, us talking about the 90s right now is people in the 90s talking about the 60s. And when I think about that, I'm okay, there are periods of time where we can look back and, start putting these decades in their bin, the 1920s, the 50s. Okay, now we're in the 2000s, the 2010s. And for us and in it blurs, right? It blurs together. I think the greatest metric for looking at how time has passed is looking at the music and the art that has changed from this period to period. Because right now it's just this kind of blending blur of tech to tech to tech. It's okay, Facebook replaces MySpace. And then from there we have Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and Twitter and all these new communication platforms that have subtle nuances that can find a new way for people to address large unknown groups of people with an idea. And I'm okay, so what are the 2050s going to look like? And right now, I feel the only context people talk about what will 2050 look like is the environment. That's it. I feel that's usually all I read or hear about is what will the environment and climate change issues look like in 2050. But other than that, I haven't heard anything about what do we want the ideal, medical space to look like? What do we want the education to look like in 2050? How are we evolving our transportation infrastructure? Not really. People are okay, by 2024, we want to have this. And I'm that's so small. That's saying by next week, we want to have a new product built.
Well, check this out. So it's I think the 2050 predictions are a good conversation because it, again, brings up the idea of, what's being incentivized right now? That which is not incentivized will never get done. If you don't incentivize anything to get whatever aspect, whatever topic sector done, you'll never see any development in that field. And so it's okay, what fields are being incentivized right now, right? You look at education, huge things for STEM, right? It's usually huge money lending into stem cell research, not stem cell, but STEM research, and just getting young kids into STEM just because it's, it's a tough and challenging and very useful, valuable area, right? Mm-hmm. And so you see a lot of development in just, pure maths and so forth. And that's what we've been doing great at. But now it's we're in the era of, like you said, social communication, large scale integration of tech with psychology. And so it's what are the incentives to actually get these things done? Or maybe it's climate change. What are the rewards that come with actually pursuing climate change? Everyone's you got to pursue climate change or else you're going to die. And I'm that's not a good incentive for me, man. I'm going to die anyways. what is another incentive that is more tangible that I can actually achieve in a lifetime? It's like, okay, you work on doing this for climate change, we're going to reward you this much. And they do this in the patent space for any pharmaceutical program. It's like, okay, you want to get a super cheap new form of insulin. What are the incentives, right? So once I develop insulin, spend all this time, money, research into getting this brand new insulin that I can license out there, it's like, I want to be rewarded by patent exclusivity rights to exclusively sell that drug so I can make money. And then after a period of time, then that drug goes generic, and then it gets super, super cheap, right? Because then you basically spread out open the competition space. And so it's like, in terms of like other industries, what is that incentive? Like, what are the patent exclusivity rights for a product incentives for other areas? That's what needs to be thought of. Instead of like thinking like, okay, what needs to get done? It's like, well, what incentives need to get done? I think
it's because you can't commercialize philanthropy.
Right.
I think is what it is. Like you can't.
And we're realizing
we've commercialized the human body to incredible extents, and like you can't commercialize positive philanthropy toward the environment. Otherwise, it would have been done. Right. We can commercialize in the private sector new technological advances that, in an auxiliary way, benefit groups of people or the environment or new ways of doing something. So like electric vehicles and Tesla, right? Like the driving force behind a lot of this is they're more sustainable, they're more environmentally friendly in the long term of internal combustion engines, but no one really did it because it was so good for the environment. It was a feasible and profitable idea that, if engineered the right way, can have these auxiliary benefits.
Right.
We would not have near the level of groundbreaking medical technology and research and development and life-saving treatments that we have if it was not a commercially sustainable business. That's a fact.
I really like the idea that you can't commercialize philanthropy. I think that is very true. And I think to basically remedy, you have to break down what philanthropy is in concrete terms. So it's like, okay, we're making a transition to, more sustainable cars, right? Let's look at the reason why I'd even do it. Like it's pure philanthropy to just kind of do it without analyzing, hey, how is that going to affect my gas bill? How is that going to affect my energy bill? Because I'm not going to be incentivized as a user to be gung-ho about, the green energy transfer when I'm paying $4.50, $4.60 per gallon, right? Like if you look at other states, if you go like in the South, you're going to get like $2.50 per gallon. Like that's an incentive. Lower my gas prices, lower how much the quality costs. And then I'm actually going to pursue it. And we're going to continue to increase that positive gain there. And like, that's what's not being incentivized in the green industry in my eyes.
Well, I think especially out in California, it's a disincentive. It's like, oh, you want to drive a gas vehicle? Okay, you're going to pay for it. Like you're going to pay more if you want to do that, and disincentivize, like, okay, say the environment and environmental protection is ironically such a huge core part of conversations in California. Do they update infrastructure and highways and roads to fit and accommodate the level of traffic that we have? Or are they saying no? Like, you don't like it? Take public transportation. Use different modes of transportation to get where you need to go. Why would we make it more easy or easier to populate the roads even further with vehicles if we don't want them to be there in the first place?
Yes, exactly.
Pay more for gas. Like they're trying to control the supply and demand from like a price crunch where it's like, okay, you want this commodity, which we don't want you to have. We'll make it harder for you to have it. So you have to pay for it. So therefore it has a greater value to you. Recognize the value that it brings your life because you will literally pay for it.
And this ties all back into what we were talking before about the difference between negative rewards versus positive rewards. Positive rewards have better effects than negative rewards.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And this is just point in case. Like if you say you have to do this, right? It's like, it's a negative reward, like just right in there. And it's like, I'm not as incentivized if it was a positive. It's an add to my life.
Yeah.
I'm not like changing what I'm doing in my life. I'm adding to what I'm doing in my life.
So I think during the pandemic, one of the top things that people I know talked about who still had to commute for work, so that did R&D and worked in labs is so often, oh my gosh, there's no traffic. This is incredible. There's no traffic. I can get to work in 35 minutes. What used to take me an hour each way. And I think people were so surprised about this positive gain that they were so used to the negative. They're like, yeah, it's my commute. It is what it is. I live an hour and 15 minutes away from work. And that's just that's the way it is. Like, that's what I have to do. And then when that was alleviated, oh my gosh, I can get to work in 35 minutes. This is incredible. Look at I love this. And now that things are starting to open back up and people are coming back, the traffic's coming back, and it almost feels like the momentary, or at least segment of period of prize that the lack of traffic is equal to how it's been taken away in the opposite direction. So if having traffic normally was part of your routine, you accepted it, it's what it was, put you at a -2. So not that bad, right? It doesn't, only -2. But then the reduction of traffic put you at a +4.
Exactly.
But now that the traffic is back, you're at a -4.
Yes. Right.
But it's just what it was before.
Because you got used to it.
You were already used to it though.
Right. And so it's like, oh yeah. And so it's on this expected.
Yeah.
If you expect a gain of 4, right? Now you're going to get a gain of -4 when you find that it's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Right. Versus
but it's right back to where it was.
Right.
Which you were at a -2 before. Now you're at a -4. So now people talk about the traffic coming back more than they talked about it when it was normal.
Right. And this is just because we get normalized to things. And there is that irrelevance of the last couple of months, right? It's about the last very short term amounts of time, like in relative to what you've just experienced.
Yeah.
And that just shows, the level of perspective is relatively low when we're making decisions and we're making rational decisions on how these things are going to affect us and how they make us feel on a positive or negative spectrum. Right. And it is just realizing, hey, wait, why did traffic only make me feel negative? Just because we were used to it, right? It was the expected outcome. And this is like the whole thing. It's like, there's a huge push though. Like the outcome here is, okay, let's virtualize work, right? Everyone's working from home. Now there's a huge push to virtualize work because of those gains in the commuter field. Mm-hmm. That's just a positive incentive. Yeah. Right. You're at home. There's all the positives of being at home and so forth. I mean, maybe the distractions, like the only negative con, like you're potentially a little more distracted, but that's how you incentive change.
Yeah.
There's a net positive outcome. Simple as that, right? When you look at the transfer, like the forceful transfer of, petroleum products to green new products, that isn't existing. That's why it's not being incentivized, right? I have higher gas prices now.
Yeah.
That sucks. That's not good. I don't want that. I'm not going to support something that just takes more money out, and people might be like, well, you're just, environmentally unconscious about this stuff. And I'd be like, well, it's looking at the outcomes. This makes me feel this way, and this one doesn't make me feel that way. Mm-hmm. And okay, when you do that, when you create this gap, it's like, okay, well, how profitable are these industries in the first place? What are the incentives inside the green companies to actually produce new innovative products? They're competing with oil and gas, who already produces energy at this rate. Unless they can do that, and then people would be saying okay, well, gas is going to run out. And I'm like, okay, well, how long? What's the time scale? Let's talk about actual outcomes, tangible, concrete solutions to change incentives. We do have environmental problems. I'm totally on board with that, right? No doubt there. It's just how do we incentivize people to actually innovate?
I think you finished the sentence where people usually don't get to. And you said creating new solutions, which people have tried to do over and over and time again, creating new solutions to address these environmental problems we have, but where I feel like we don't finish is to change incentives. How do we change people's incentives to want to change their life? And you can get on board with a lot of people who have this philanthropic or altruistic, perspective to things. I want to make this world better. I want to, my almost trivial difference or minuscule difference that I can make collectively makes a difference, right? Where it's the sum of all of us together. If we all try and get everyone on board, can make a difference. But I don't think there's true incentives that make people want to make drastic changes. And I think now a lot of the focus is forcing incentives for, N+2 and reactions.
Here's where it gets wild, right? And I don't want to get too political, but the whole idea, just take a step back on the idea of COVID for a second, just without all of its political ties right now. Just think about COVID as a problem, as an incentive, right? You don't want to get sick, right? And so, right, the fact that COVID is there, you can basically do a bunch of stuff so long as COVID is there and just say, hey, you don't want to get sick by COVID, do this now. right? And so what you do is you actually create a bunch of policies that aren't necessarily using the outcome effectively. They're just making the assumption that, hey, we can make these changes because you're going to be incentivized by COVID to accept it, regardless if it even has a change. They're just using COVID as a generalizing incentive structure for all of these things, binning them all together and using COVID kind of as an excuse to, start making these mandates and making these changes. And a lot of the conflict here is that some people are saying, hey, COVID, my risk of getting COVID isn't actually that big of a risk or a concern to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to be incentivized to actually follow through with all of your mandates because I don't see your logic of how doing these things is going to reduce my risk of COVID,
Yeah. It's a tricky conversation because I think a lot of people have a lot of different perspectives and personal choices that they want to make. And there's always the dichotomy of like, okay, how do your personal choices affect yourself versus your personal choices affect everybody else? And I think an interesting analogy could be, say you live in San Francisco, these houses that are literally wall to wall, there is no space between houses, and you have 10 houses in a row where 9 out of the 10 of them have an internal sprinkler fire deterrent system, right? But one doesn't. So it's are you going to live on that block of the street when one house could ablaze, which could burn the other ones? While even if you have a fire in the other ones, it likely won't be as bad. And if that one house goes flaming up, it will still cause damage to your house. But since you have a sprinkler system, it likely won't burn down. Do you just force that house to get a sprinkler system anyways? Or you're okay, well, I have one and you don't have one and I want to live here and have my own life. Hope your house doesn't burn down and affect my house. But my house is sure shit not going to burn down. And it's okay, the long term versus the short term. Do we know what the long term effects are? No, because we're living in it right now. We will not know and we won't know forever. Right. That's just a risk. That's the risk reward that you have to kind of take. So it's okay, look at yourself personally and the choices you want to make. And I've heard every single different argument where people are oh, well then if we're forcing people to take the vaccine, why can't we force people to make healthier life choices? Because it's also a burden on the healthcare system. So there's so many different approaches.
Them together, right?
There's so many different approaches.
Each outcome has to have its own relevant incentive.
They're individual.
And my incentive is not your incentive. So in the case of the fire example, it's I'm incentivized to keep my house intact by having a sprinkler system. Just because you don't have one, that's not, that shouldn't be my reason. It's get your own things in order, right? Be in control of your own life, take responsibility for your own incentives. You don't want your house to burn down, right? Get a fire system for yourself, right? Yeah. Those incentives are your incentives, not my own. And if everyone just kind of looks over their own incentives, everyone's going to be making moves. Mm-hmm. That so long correlates with society. The second you try to lump incentives together and start saying, hey, this is a group's incentive, the group's not going to do anything, because then you get into the group psychology aspect where it's think about when you go into when you're in school and you get assigned a group project, right? And it's usually 4 or 5 people. What always ends up happening is usually there's 1 or 2 individuals that will take the charge and do most of the project. Mm-hmm. The other people will not do it. Right. And so the actual amount that you'd expect from a group of 5 is actually of much lower quality. And I think this is what happens when you do these grouping identities for incentives, right? The incentive has to be belong to every single individual, not just a certain select few that agree with the idea. They have to actually use those incentives to actually develop a group effort. And I think too often people just want others to do the things and they just want to say, hey, I agree with you, but I don't want to actually, change my incentive structure to match doing something that is more beneficial. Yeah. You see what I mean? In a very abstract way, but on a large scale, I can see this happening all the time. It's just all these people gravitate around climate change and they all use it as communicating and speaking points and so forth. And I'm that's great. You're raising the awareness of this issue. Now do something, just because you were very enamored by someone who was speaking on global climate change or something. And then you start to decide, okay, my incentive is to speak on climate change. Since everyone's speaking about climate change, no one's getting anything done about climate change. Yeah. The fact that someone who's speaking about climate change doesn't motivate any incentives to actually fix climate change. And it's a hard freaking problem. I'm not just saying it's an easy thing. You can just do it one by one. But the fact that it's just I don't know. I all too often just see awareness raising events without any iterative concrete solutions to start actually changing that is both, consistent with the incentives of the mass. And that's the most challenging aspect is, when you're trying to transfer to like green new energy or whatever, the incentive just isn't there yet. Like for both the investor side to actually develop those products and on the consumer who has to actually pay more money to actually get these products going underway. And so it's like this whole balance equation. It's like, okay, we need something different. We need a solution. And that's what we should be talking about. We should be raising awareness about the solutions, not just saying, hey, here's a solution. It doesn't really work that well, but it's something. It's like, okay, let's just keep ideating. Let's keep incentivizing innovation about it, or else it's never going to change.
Yeah. I would love to talk to someone who works like very, very closely with kind of these World Economic Forum philanthropic problems. And I often wonder, incentives obviously change when you're not spending someone else's money. And that's when I look at like the Gates Foundation and all of these like privately funded, also publicly funded, but privately funded efforts and organizations that collectively find talent that's really, truly passionate about wanting to use their skills and their benefits and access and resources to enact change in like different places. And when I look at the people who work as product managers and like there's a title for them, like organizational managers at like the Gates Foundation, they have some hefty backgrounds. Like they have some really established people come in and have a career learning all these different things and then going and working on, virology research and development for malaria and all this stuff in different parts of the world. And it makes me wonder, like, can the government or at least like public institutions organize change on that scope? And it makes me wonder how the incentives change when you're spending someone else's money. Like if you are a very wealthy investor wanting to make philanthropic change, like the Parker Institute for Cancer or the Gates Foundation, which is funded by probably a mix. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm assuming they have grant funding as well as like private funding. People probably try a lot harder when your dollar's on the line.
And I think this is the whole problem with having high taxation rates in a country, right? The more you tax, the more you basically give people your money to do with what they think is best for you. And it's like, well, it's not their money and they're not going to be as incentivized to, look over each penny of those amounts of monies and funds because it's not their money. They just got it. And so you're going to see that the quality of the product they produce with that money is usually low. And so you see, like, if you look at just the contrast in different private institutions and public institutions, you can really see, there's a clear dichotomy. And I won't even make the argument that it is better or worse. I'll leave that up to anyone else who looks at these things and observes and to make their own conclusions. But I'm just saying there is a clear difference, and it should be well noted that it can potentially have bad outcomes when you basically are not spending your own money and you're not aware of, just how important those funds are to your living and livelihood and whatnot, whatever it may be. And, it's just a very tricky equation, and it's tough, man. You just have to have people that are responsible of these incentive structures and what's going to change their motives for action. And I think that's really the centralizing idea here is just, what motivates action?
Mm-hmm. I like thinking about it on the individual perspective. Like, I think that's where I've been able to conceptualize the most tangible change of action is on an individual scale where more often, because it's the loudest, we see the mass mentality of group psychology change and the way people as a whole can get behind an idea. But I think when you look at an individual go through steps of change and recognize changes in incentive and like goal setting, like how can you take an individual person who has experienced, XYZ things in their life and say like, okay, now from this, what set of questions? I think what I'm getting is like, what set of specific questions that are unique in the approach, but also general enough you could ask anyone to find this path. So say it's a series of questions going down a path, and the goal at the end of the path is to have this person or have someone identify what their true incentives and drives are. Because I feel like so often people are doing things for reasons they don't actually like, to fulfill goals they don't actually care about, to win prizes that have diminishing return, where it's like taking it away may not even give you like that much of a negative repercussion. Like you don't even care that much whether you have it or not, but you have it and you're used to having it, and like used to having something feels good, and having that taken away is uncomfortable. But just like how we have to adapt and change, maybe taking those things away is a challenge that has the positive reinforcement, like going to the gym or like exercise, where it's the inverse of not easy euphoria for hard or unpleasant sustaining feelings, but unpleasant temporary feelings promoting sustained euphoria and pleasure. So like, long way of asking, is there a set of questions that you could ask generally and narrow down to find out what someone truly cares about? Like, how do you find in someone, what is important to you? What do you care about? It makes me think of like the Fight Club when he's at the gas station. Like, do you have to have all of the things flash before your eyes to care enough to think, okay, take everything I have away. What's the one thing I want back?
I think that's a good place to end it. We'll leave our audience to think about that question there.
We'll bring it back.
And I think that'll conclude our episode here today. And I think, again, really the centralizing point of this episode is really what motivates action here. I mean, and the real value here is that once you get the initial action done, action precedes motivation and you start the cycle. It's just finding motivation for that one first action that gets you on the track to do whatever you think is best for yourself.
Yeah. Tomorrow can always be day one. Why not make it today?
That's right. Thank you all.
See you next time.